Hi, we continue in Genesis 14 today in the second half of the story of Abram gathering his forces to rescue his nephew Lot from the battle between the kings that have taken him from Sodom and made him captive. And in this episode, Abram will rescue Lot and then face two other people, the king of Sodom and Melchizedek, king of Salem. And there'll be two different responses there that we'll see that will tell us a lot about the relationship between Yahweh and Abram and kings in the Bible and throughout Genesis. So, as we've been looking at, one of the issues that scholars have engaged with almost obsessively are the question of sources and the divisions of the chapter. And I was highlighting last time using Gordon Wenham's work and others to see how many links there are both between Genesis 14 and the chapters that went before, as we saw in the first part of the chapter, and now measured here by verses in chapter 15, all the links mostly with the second half of the chapter. In other words, both chapter 13 before it and chapter 15 after it flow in context of chapter 14, indicating no immediate reason why we should extract chapter 14 from the sequence. In addition, there's questions within chapter 14, as we saw last time, the traditional view based on source theory and the idea of the generally anti-Jewish view. The editors were so clumsy that a clever scholar can find their work. Someone like Westermann divided it into the so-called analytic report in verses 1 to 11 and the liberation narrative in verses 12 to 14, whereas a reader like Wenham, who reads it as a consistent whole, divides it differently as three battle scenes, 1 to 16, and then the three-way confrontation between Abram, the king of Sodom, and Melchizedek is 17 to 24. But I'd like to note that if we take a little wider angle and aren't distracted by the question of different units, we can see unity across those divisions either way we count it. So here from 13 to 24, different than Westermann's 12 to 24 and different than Wenham's 17 to 24. And so we see the mention at the beginning of the end of these three individuals, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, who seem to have no reason to be named specifically. They play no role in the story at all, other than to frame this section. And then in the B parts, there's the question of the king of Sodom, who first comes out to meet Abram, and then they have a conversation in the second half, and in the center, Melchizedek and Abram, and the mention of God Most High three times. And Abram will change that here to Yahweh God Most High, as we'll look at. One way to look at it, as Westermann does, is that 18 to 20 are inserted from a later source in the middle of this. And yet without that, although there's a certain flow of the king of Sodom came out to meet and then talks to Abram and offers the gifts, it's much more dramatic with the contrast between Abram and Melchizedek first and the suspense that is created by that with what is the king of Sodom going to offer, and especially as we see it in response to Melchizedek. So there's really no reason to see insertions and multiple sources here at all. Everything in chapter 14 is integrated within itself, and everything in chapter 14 is integrated into the area around it. So there's just really no basis for dividing it up. But what there is a basis for dividing up is Abram's forces. So we look at the little bit of the battle scene in verse 15, and there's evidence that the author's really not concerned with the battle scene, which raises the question of why all the names of all those kings and places in the first part of it, because they really play no role, and only Chedorlaomer is the only one named here in verse 17. So it says he divided his forces, an unusual word here, often for land division as we see, or the people of Israel divided, which is to say the 318 trained men he has with him, unless we see that, as the Midrash did, as an expression of the numerical value of Eleazar. If you're not sure about that, go back and watch the last video. So he divides these forces against them by night. And keep in mind, these are the forces of multiple kings. And even though these are not necessarily kings of major empires, although, as we saw, one of them could suggest Assyria, in some of the others it's hard to say, certainly 300 plus men is not enough to take on an army. And yet, here it is. He and his servants, and it says, and routed them, or literally defeated them. Routed is perhaps a little too strong, but either way, defeated him and pursued him to Hobah, a place not named, but we saw on the map, far north and on the way to Damascus, which certainly is known, and farther north, and as Sarna notes, it'll link directly with 15:2, the only other time it's used in the Pentateuch. And so, again, that reference in 15:2 would make little sense unless there was the one here to pair it with. So just another element of why these things are connected, and that's one of the points we saw here in this connection here. So then he brought back all the goods and brought back his nephew Lot with the goods and the women and the people. And as scholars have pointed out, there's a chiasm in the Hebrew here that you can see, even if you can't read the Hebrew, you can see it in the translation, the interlinear translation here. And so we see it reading from right to left. which is to say, sorry, back up here is the beginning of the verse. So he brought back all the goods and also Lot, his brother, literally his brother, and the goods he brought back as well. So we see brother Lot here, not his nephew, but brother in the broad sense of any family member. Any kinsman can be described, male kinsman can be described as a brother in that sense. But we see the emphasis on that in this chiastic shape, and has been noted here that highlights that the women and the people are separate, and we see that here at the end. We've not seen anything about women that suggests what will be implied in chapter 19, both Lot's wife and the two daughters, who will have an intimate and unseemly relationship at the end of chapter 19, as we'll see. So returning to our chiasm here, so we can have that up as we go. So he's brought back the goods and brought back Lot with the goods. And the narrator finally summarizes the end of the war here. And this is where we see the issue of Wenham's different scene. But in this quote here, I believe it's from Grossman here. He says, the purpose of this portrayal is to convey that Abram's inheritance of the land is not only a result of God's blessings, but is also due to his own application of wisdom and might in his involvement in local and world politics. That's Grossman's view, but I would suggest it can also be read the exact opposite way, that Lot's bad choice left Abram with no choice except to rescue Lot and engage in this military battle. And we'll see other times in Genesis where people are left with bad choices, and often violent choices, because of somebody else's previous bad choice, especially in chapter 34 when Jacob settles near a city. And we'll see a similar issue of urban violence against the people of Yahweh here. So after his return from this defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, notice just this one is named, the king of Sodom went out, which is to say one of the kings that was protected by Abram's outing here, and ought to be grateful. And so we don't know what he's going to do. It says he went out to meet him in the valley of Shava, which is to say the king's valley, but which means level or equal, which is to say a level valley or a valley, which is obviously redundant. A valley would generally be level, but it can be read as equals, as Grossman does, suggesting an implication of an equality between Abram and Melchizedek. And we see similar things like the cave in chapter 23 that Abram negotiates a purchase from the Hittites to bury Sarah in, and will also be the family cave. Machpelah means couples, or cave of couples, and so Abraham and Sarah will both be in that cave of couples. So a number of times when the story in relation to people is replicated by the names of places that we'll see here. So they go out and meet in the Valley of Equals, but before King of Sodom and Abram meet, King Melchizedek of Salem comes out. So we're going to see two competing kings, the king of Sodom and the king of Salem. And the king of Sodom, of course, will tell us something about what is to come in chapter 18 and 19 as well. And so here we have in verse 18, and this is the view that it's inserted within based on Westerman, and Wenham offers another view, as we've been seeing. So King Melchizedek, a name that means my Lord, or king, is Zadok, which would say just, or it can also mean my God is salvation, which is to say it's a Hebrew name. And so this king is not obviously a quote-unquote Israelite. There is no such thing yet. And a Hebrew name for a local person would be anachronistic. Abram wouldn't be speaking Hebrew either. He'd be speaking Akkadian, the language of of the Chaldeans, of which he came out. There's no reason to think any of these people would be speaking a language that we know as Hebrew. But that's the convention of the text, just like in early Western movies, all the Native Americans notice. Indians then, or worse, all spoke English, or a primitive version of English to suggest that they were barbarians, but that's another issue. So, King Melchizedek of Salem, sometimes taken to mean Jerusalem, based on Psalm 63, and we can go to that there, where it says, one verse up in the English, his abode has been established in Salem, his dwelling place in Zion, and Zion is plainly the mountain on which Jerusalem is built, and so that's one element where Salem and Jerusalem would be seen as similar. But they're not otherwise the same word, and there's no evidence that Salem was an earlier name for Jerusalem either. And similarly with Jerusalem, since it was a city of the Jebusites until in 2 Samuel 5, David took it from him, that it would have had a Hebrew name before Israelites came along and might have renamed it. So there's no reason to associate this with Jerusalem. That doesn't mean it isn't, and especially in Christian tradition, which we're not going to take up here. But the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament certainly takes a lot of time to explore King Melchizedek in Salem here. So he brought out bread and wine. This is a first, and obviously for a Christian audience, that's That sounds like Jesus in the Eucharist. But bread and wine were common offerings simply because they were common fruit of the earth. To this day, blessing over the bread and blessing over the wine are basic table blessings in an observant Jewish house. So there's no reason to associate that with Jesus or make it Christian. This is the first time since the penalty of bread in chapter 3, verse 19, when the Adam was sentenced to bring forth bread by the sweat of his brow and fighting with the earth for it, since obviously the earth doesn't produce bread, humans produce bread from the grain. And wine here, and this is the first wine since Noah's wine, and the next wine is going to be the wine that Lot's daughters make their father drink to get him drunk. So this is a sacred wine placed in between two very suspect wine situations that involve either explicit questionable sexuality or implicit questionable sexuality in the relation to Noah's son and then Ham in the Canaan situation. But no bread or wine is said to be drunk here. It's simply brought out, and the king is also said to be priest of God Most High. We need to look at both pieces of that more closely. A Cohen here for the first time in Genesis, and we don't see Cohens, we don't see priests in Genesis because it's obviously anachronistic in the time period of the story. The Cohens were associated with urban temples, and obviously Abram is out here away from urban places. And we can even read this text as perhaps anti-priestly in the sense it's anti-urban. We don't see any Israelite priests anywhere in here. As Sarna, in my note below, says, it is not known whether the fusion of the royal and priestly offices was characteristic of the Canaanite city-states or was peculiar to Salem. In Assyria and among the Hittites, the king was also high priest, but such was not the case in Babylon. It's hard for us to make too much of historical evidence of that. But we can look at the literary issue here of God Most High, El Elyon. And it's only expressed this way in Psalm 78:35, but the question of God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, is more, as we'll see. I find 30 examples of this, and one of the questions is, was this originally a different God, and that it's associated with Yahweh? And that's one of the issues we'll see here. But El Elyon is known as otherwise a Canaanite God, and nothing is said by the narrator here of a detail of that God. It will be here in this next verse where the king speaks out loud and says that in particular here. So Westerman suggests that the cultic blessing by the priest in the sanctuary or from the sanctuary is foreign to the patriarchal period, and there's no question about that. One of the questions that will come up later in Genesis is whether a human blessing like this is meaningful or not. Here we can sort of make an assumption that this is a positive thing, that he's offering this blessing to Abram by God Most High. But when Isaac offers a blessing to his son Jacob, who takes it surreptitiously, hiding himself as Esau much later in the story, we can really question whether a paternal blessing or even a human priestly blessing is efficacious, or only the blessing that comes from God actually is powerful. These are just human words, and what makes King Melchizedek's words actually effective in attributing to Yahweh, or in this case to El Elyon, an intention toward Abram. So we have to really question that, but mostly in light of things we'll see later in Genesis. But both the narrator and Melchizedek say Barak here in the verb. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High." And here's the key phrase, used incredibly ironically here for close readers. Maker of heaven and earth, which is a phrase used in the Hebrew Bible a number of times in the Psalms. And here's an example that we really need to look at so we can see what's at issue. In Psalm 146, we hear this phrase in this context. Do not put your trust in princes and mortals in whom there is no help. When their breath departs, they return to the earth. On that very day, their plans perish. Happy are those whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is Yahweh their God, who made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, who keeps faith forever, who executes justice for the oppressed, who gives food to the hungry. In other words, don't put your trust in King Melchizedek of Salem, or the king of Sodom for that matter, or in the king of Babylon in exile, or any other kings, but simply in Yahweh your God. And really, ironically here, this is an expression of what Genesis is saying against those who would have taken the king of Babylon, or maybe the king of Persia after exile, like they do in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, as Yahweh's agent. But here, this implicit echo of Psalm 146 really undermines this whole thing. And the irony is it's coming from the mouth of a king. Don't put your trust in humans and kings. And so there it is for close readers. And then after that, he says, and blessed be God, El Elyon, who has delivered your enemies into your hand here. Asher Migin here is a word used for shield in 15:1, one of those connections there. The word for enemies your enemy Tsar here, which literally means narrow or contracted, but can mean enemy, is only here in Genesis, although it's 69 times in the Masoretic text. And note that he says, your enemies, as if all this was about was the king of Sodom praising Abram for doing a good job on something the king of Sodom had nothing to do with. But of course, it was the king of Sodom's enemies as well. And so he blesses him for being a warrior, successful warrior here. And then there's a deep ambiguity in this next phrase. The Hebrew does not say Abram here. It simply says, and he gave him 1/10 of everything. And so there's three possibilities, even though scholars tend to see only two possibilities. As Grossman here, says, the reader is made to feel that even if in reality it was Abraham who offered the tithe, the literary reality would justify a reversal of roles. The advantage of this dual reading is that the reciprocal relationship between Abram and Melchizedek is if to say it really doesn't matter who gave to whom. The two characters are inseparable and equal. Perhaps the two meet in the valley of Shava equal for this reason. But the two options that Grossman considers, that Melchizedek gives 1/10 to Abram, or that Abram gives 1/10 to Melchizedek, there's one more possibility, that Abram gave Yahweh 1/10 in response to Melchizedek blessing Abram by God Most High. And then, of course, to the king of Sodom, in another verse and a half, Abram will swear to Yahweh, God Most High. So that would make the most sense that Abram gave it to Yahweh, whatever giving in this context means, since obviously there's no temple or Yahwistic officials here to offer things. And what that everything, which is to say all the goods that he gained in the war, how all that would be offered to Yahweh is not clear. But there's certainly no reason to think that Abram would be paying off the king of Sodom when Abram risked his life to protect the king, who did not seem to risk his own life, because there he was waiting for Abram after the battle. So now, after Melchizedek is done, the chiasm returns to the king of Sodom, saying to Abram, give me the people or the persons, but take the goods for yourself. And as a number of scholars note here, as Wenham notes, the meanness of the king of Sodom stands in stark contrast. There's none of the customary courtesy here. Whereas Sarna adds, the king of Sodom came out empty-handed to meet his benefactor, and the first word he uttered was give. Which is setting us up for the destruction of Sodom in chapter 19, even though Abram will argue for the preservation of Sodom if there are only a handful of good people. So the king of Sodom comes out, give me the people, which is ambiguous here. It's a question of whether he wants his own people back or he wants slaves, whether he wants to benefit from this, which would be a common thing in a military victory. But of course, it wasn't his military victory, it was Abram's military victory. Or whether he sees Abram having stolen Lot and he wants Lot back. But it's ambiguous there, and we don't know. And he allows him to keep the goods for himself, as if Abram needs his permission. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have sworn, or literally raised my hand, in a scene that is not narrated, to Yahweh, God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. Let's go down and see the rest of our scene here. That I would not take a thread or a sandal thong. The word for thread here is only here in the Pentateuch, used a couple of times. And sandal thong, serach na'al, is only once elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible in Isaiah 5:27, which is to say two tiny things, or anything that is yours. So you might not say, I have made Abram rich. Which is to say, Abram sees through this. Abram sees that the king of Sodom wants to make Abram into a patron, or a client rather, that the king would be a patron, that Abram would be beholden to the king of Sodom, and that would be a word out there, that people would know that this Abram, who was able to defeat all these other kings, was now working for the king of Sodom and been paid off for him. And he refuses it. Just absolutely outright. And it's a long speech given everything else we've seen. And many scholars have commented on what a strong response it is to the king of Sodom. Basically a no, not a chance. But to see the last verse here, and we end the chapter here, I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me, Ner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Naming those three, and again, I don't see any reason to name those three other than to frame this section chiastically. And so in other words, these people deserve simply to receive what they've had to eat and the share of the goods, which is to say they were mercenaries hired for this purpose, and fair enough. But Abram himself is not going to be benefited by that. And we see no response, even though Abram has spoken very harshly to the king of Sodom, and many kings would say, how dare you, and perhaps even arrest him for it. There's nothing said, and after this, it'll go back to Abram and Yahweh. So that completes chapter 14, and I hope at the end of this we can hear both how tightly integrated chapter 14 is within itself and to the chapters around, but also how chapter 15 will make much more sense when we've read chapter 14 as we have. See you next time as we move into chapter 15. Bye-bye.